and we lose a lot of incredible talent just because people need to pay their bills. And that's totally respectable. I'm not in the Stallman camp of, you should only write free software or you should die. Like, that's just that's just not viable. I think if you need to go work at Google or Facebook or some, just some random average like dev firm just to pay your bills, I think that's completely reasonable. But it would be nice if there was more of an ability for people to actually be able to continue operating in this space.
Yeah, and I think that's comes down to having kind of honest and open conversations about where open source is weak and where it does make things more difficult. Because I think a lot of those things can be fine in open source if you do things in certain ways. Like, for example, I've managed to cover my living costs, but I'm not earning as much as I was. Far from it. But I'm getting to a point where I'm more and more sustainable, and there's a lot of businesses that are able to make it succeed. So when I see headlines out there saying open source is not sustainable, or it needs to change, what they really say is not sustainable for their particular business model or for their idea of growth or for exactly how they want to run their business or how they want to do things, which is perfectly valid. And I think being more open about that is important, so people coming into it know those challenges up front rather than being hit with them later and then having to revert a course or be trapped by their license and things like that. And it's, the Futo themselves are saying a lot of the right things. Like they had a video on saying how we need to change the discourse of payment in open source. We need to be more open about how we should be happy to pay for open source and how it should be an acceptable practice. But I mean, this isn't something new. I remember when Elementary OS put that kind of paywall up where you can put 0 in. Well, I thought that was a great idea because at least it just made people think about the process as they go and try and download that software. They're put up with that barrier thinking, oh, should I be paying for this? I thought it was open source, which it absolutely is. But yeah, we need to be open on it. It's like Krita. I'm never sure how to say that.
I just say Krita. I mispronounce everything, so just don't take my word for anything.
It's like they put themselves on the Steam store and Windows Store and charge some money, and you see people kind of give them some grief for that, saying, "Why do I have to download this?" Or "What is this? This is some kind of scam because I thought it was free." And it's like, no, all the power to that project. We have to find ways to fund projects. So yeah, all those things are perfectly valid and they're real problems. But I don't think that we need to change what open source is to meet those particular problems, because that's what we'd have to do if we're gonna meet those via licenses and via requirements. Then it basically fundamentally conflicts on those essential freedoms of open source or free software, which is where you get this contention, because people really want to use that open source term because of its reputation, its sexiness, its adoption. But a lot of the time, or actually in very few times, they don't want to accept the loss of giving up rights to users that would require. And again, maybe not intentionally. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And that's why I think it's important to also accept and somewhat embrace other options out there as well, such as what Futo want to do with their licenses and what their vision is for their software. I think it's perfectly reasonable to be able to define terms to protect your own efforts. If that's what's going to make you a living, if you're putting the effort in, and as long as you're allowed to do so as per the terms of the software that you're using to build that, then yeah, absolutely go ahead. But doing that as part of open source, I think, is where the trouble lies, which is, well, I think it'll be healthier to establish something adjacent, because like you said, there's source available, but no one, it's not a very sexy term. People really don't like to use source available, and people say it's confusing. So I think having a term established in that area would really help people have a choice over open source as a term, which is where I think the fair code movement is quite good. So I think that was originally created by the authors of the N8N project, the automation software.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's quite emotionally evocative, fair code. Again, it's a simplified term, so there's an education piece behind that of what it means, which is why they've attempted to define that. But I think by having that word fair, I think that's quite a powerful thing that could be branded. And like Futo, I came across Sentry doing a lot of advocacy for changing open source and a lot of efforts trying to put in via many blog post streams to get users to want to change open source. And I saw they're having discussions over their own licensing, which I jumped in and got involved with, and I really kind of try to get them to understand that it will be more beneficial if they kind of create that separate brand, because they've got some resources, they've got contacts, they're fairly well known within that, especially within that VC space. They could really kind of make some difference there, and I think they're going to team up with the Fair Code people and kind of rebrand that under Fair Source later this year, which I think should kind of ease the contention within the landscape a little bit by providing those options.
Yeah, I think the main issue with trying to redefine open source is there is a lot of people out there who are happy with what open source is. They are happy with the way the OSI has defined it. They are happy with the way these licenses work. And if that's what you're happy with, that's awesome, right? Keep doing what you're doing. I think if you start trying to redefine open source, and you brought this up in your blog post, what you're going to have happen is there are going to be people that are now even more confused about what it means for this to be open source. Like, are we talking about Futo open source? Are we talking about Sentry open source? Are we talking about OSI open source? Are we talking about the non-technical usage of open source? Like, what are we actually referring to when we are talking about this? And the only way to properly know that is you would need to have a good understanding of the license, which in the state we're currently in, a lot of people don't have a good understanding of the license. So requiring both a good understanding and knowledge of the existing definitions that are out there, all this ends up doing is confusing both the user, who isn't really sure about what protections they have under the software, and the developer, who may be incredibly unaware of what they're allowed to do with the software. Like, one obvious difference between Futo open source and OSI open source is the whole way you can do funding. The fact that you are not allowed to change payment links in the Futo open source definition, which I get where they're coming from with that, but I think it completely kills the concept of derived works, and I don't think in the long run is going to make the most sense to keep a project alive. It'll keep it alive as long as the developers are working on it, but if they ever step away, that project is dead.
Yeah, it's about who you're providing those freedoms to, and those really kind of, a lot of these cases are where people are putting terms on protect the original authors for a lot of the time sustainability reasons instead of putting your code out there to the users, which is more what open source is really about. And especially in a case like Futo, it's a lot of it really makes sense, especially if you're not deep into this world, because a lot of the things they're saying is like, oh yeah, we want to do this to protect other people from freeloading off of our work. We want to do it to prevent adware, to prevent malware, and all that seems absolutely reasonable. And I truly believe they're trying to do something good, and they think they're doing something good. But you see, it's like when they talk about being brought up upon open source, they're confused about it, because they're saying, oh, people calling us out for calling us open source, but we're just trying to prevent malware and adware. Who wouldn't want that? So it's difficult, because you then have to have that bit of past experience and know some history, or see some of those examples and know the freedoms that these protects, because especially on that distribution element, that's the one that's probably the hardest to see, because that seems reasonable, like an author protecting their work, and it totally is. But that does prevent a large class of being able to fork software and for it to build up over time, which is not something you're going to immediately think about when coming to a project as a new user, because everything's probably all hunky-dory, it's all fine. And I've seen authors make the case for this as well. It's like, oh yeah, this license, for the majority of our users, it doesn't matter that it's not fully open source, they can still use it and everything. And that's fine for now, and that's fine for the perspective of the author. But I think it's more common than ever within the software world that users tend to get screwed over at some point in time or other, either by the original authors changing directions, wanting to change up the licensing terms to suit their business model, sneakily taking bits out of maybe their open offering and put them under a different license, or maybe the company gets acquired down the line, and now the new people have a completely different idea of what they want to do. Mm-hmm. So that's where these kind of terms can cause trouble, because within standard kind of open source software, other people will be able to then pick that up and take that away. It allows momentum to build by allowing other businesses to start using your software. It's like with my software Bookstack, other people can host it. So there's now service providers using that for business income. Other people have asked if they can provide support for that, and said, yeah, that's fine. And then there's more businesses using it. And as you're gaining that momentum around a project, around an open source project, that's more people depending on that software, and that's more energy and momentum that can carry that on past that original author. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important part of open source software, is that things can survive past that original author. Mm-hmm. It's like even with Futo, with Lewis Rossman involved, he says a lot of times, don't trust me, go by what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And essentially a license like that does require a bit of trust, because that's forever tied to the authors of that software. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, and he's proved himself very respectable in a lot of ways, but there still is that kind of implicit tie within the license, within the idea of open source there. Whereas, open source is really about kind of letting that go.
Mm-hmm.